Now for more on that new report from the Australia Institute showing that concern for climate change is at an all-time high as the federal government continues its attempts to finalise a policy ahead of the Glasgow summit.
The Institute's Climate and Energy Program Director, Richie Merzian, joins us now. Richie, good morning. Australians are concerned according to the survey. Take us through some of the key and, I guess, most concerning numbers.
So what we've seen is that Australians are concerned about climate. That hasn't dissipated despite a pandemic. 75% of Australians say that they're concerned. And when it comes to some particular impacts like bushfires or drought, 82% of Australians are concerned that climate change will cause more of these impacts. And around half of those numbers are saying that those impacts are happening now. So that concern has only grown. And alongside that has been a growing appetite for more climate policy to address this, in particular, taking forward what the Glasgow Climate Conference is asking for, which is immediate impact as well.
OK, now I want to talk about a couple of the targets. I'll get to 2050 in a moment, but what do people think about the Australian government upping its ambitions in the short term, say adjusting its 2030 climate target?
We saw just over a majority of Australians support an increase in that 2030 target. It's worth remembering that hasn't increased in 7 years, whereas many allies, the US, EU, Japan, have all pretty much doubled their efforts. We've also seen a support for the International Energy Agency's pathway for net zero by 2050, which says that there's no more room for new coal or gas projects. So 60% of Australians support that pathway, and that number remains about the same whether you ask people in urban areas or people in regional areas. There's a strong appetite for an immediate halt to new fossil fuels, which has ultimately the largest benefit in terms of reducing immediate emissions.
OK, so all this comes, of course, as Cabinet today, as you know, Richie, sits down to try to nut out a climate policy and maybe a firmer 2050 target. What will be the consequences, in your view, if Scott Morrison goes to Glasgow, and we assume now he is going to Glasgow, without committing firmly to a net zero target by 2050?
It's basically the same as showing up empty-handed to a potluck dinner. Like the request is quite clear. Every country needs to come with an increased level of ambition. We're not on track to avoid dangerous climate change. It's what the scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reported earlier this year. So every country needs to increase that. The first step is a long-term target, that's net zero by 2050, but really, given this is the anniversary of the Paris Agreement, everyone's asking for more short-term action. That's doubling that 2030 target, that's halting new coal and gas projects. Because ultimately, if you have net zero by 2050 alone, and it has no immediate impact, it's not legally binding, it has a number of loopholes, it allows more fossil fuels to flourish, then it won't really stack up and it won't be that well received.
Fascinating survey. Also interesting to see what the government comes up with. Richie Merzian, thank you so much for joining us on News Breakfast.
My pleasure.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.